As designers for tablets, we need to consider some very specific differences between the media. We're going to start with some broad strokes here. Let's take a look when we compare a printed magazine versus a magazine that would be published on the iPad or another tablet device such as the Nook. When we are considering how our user or our audience is going to be accessing this content, we really need to start thinking about media. Certainly when we're dealing with a tablet computer, one of the most obvious is sound. Sound does not exist in printed materials. And the other is motion. So when we're designing content for these devices, we also need to start to think about what is it our audience is going to be expecting. I'm not going to expect to touch a headline and have Oprah's voice come out, in the case of this particular edition of Fortune, on the iPad or on the Nook. I may very well have an expectation that something's going to happen if I touch something on my screen. Bringing that a step further, touch is a very important part of designing for any of these devices. Now, if you're a web designer and you've moved to designing for tablet devices, you've already started to think about, or have been thinking about, the idea of interactivity. One of the big differences between how an audience interacts with content on the tablet versus on a regular computer is the sense of touch. And when you think about clicking on a hyperlink on a website to go through, you need to remember that your user is using a mouse, and that has a very specific pinpoint area to activate that interactive element. But when we get to the tablets, what you really need to start thinking about is the fingertip. Your audience is using their finger to access and activate any interactive content. So if you take a look at your finger right now, you probably, depending on your age, size, and many other factors, have about, I don't know, maybe a 2 to 3 pica area that you're going to use to access this content. That is a very important thing for designers to remember. When you're designing content for a tablet device, you need to make sure that there's enough real estate around the interactive element to separate it from other interactive elements. So in other words, if I take this page from Fortune, the briefing, and hit that plus button to bring up whatever it brings up, I don't want to accidentally hit the hyperlink that brings me to a website because there's not enough space between those elements. If you take a look on the left, Sports Illustrated actually, I think, does a nice job of taking this capability and integrating it into their entire publication. If you touch a story, you will bring up what they call the wheel. That wheel allows you to access content related to what you're reading. You might email the editor, you might share the content to someone, there might be other photos, you might actually click on part of that wheel to bring up the stats of the athlete that you're reading about. So it's really a nice expansion of the print property into the world of interactive and tablet media. And that's really kind of what I think the ultimate goal is when we're dealing with this very brand new medium, is how do we successfully use it and take advantage of it to give our readers, our audiences, our users the experience that they expect and the experience that we can. How can we push this further to really take advantage of it so 4 to 5 years from now, when arguably people are using tablet computers in their everyday life, like they might use their televisions, or their toasters or their telephones or any device that we kind of take for granted now because they've been around so long. What is the future of this medium going to be? And that's why this is a very exciting time to be working and to be designing, because we're kind of inventing it as we go along. That allows us to make some mistakes that people won't be that critical of because it is so new, although that is changing very rapidly. And it will also allow us to maybe not be bound by what we think it should be. One of the other things that we need to consider is actually the layout of the content itself. when we think about printed versus interactive content, printed is linear and interactive is radial. So if I compare the two, I will see that in the printed edition, I've got a front cover, a back cover, and stuff in the middle. And I know where I am because I'm either looking at the cover, either front or back, so I know I'm at the beginning or the end, or I'm between it. And when I see those pages, as I turn them, as I'm getting further toward the back, I have more pages on my left, and as I'm getting further toward the front, I have more pages on my right. That's very simple. There's a visual indicator of where you are. When you get into interactive content, you're dealing with something that's radial. You're getting in at a certain point, and then you can go anywhere in the content. So I could see a feature, if I'm reading an e-magazine, somewhere in the middle that I can jump to with a click of a button, but I don't have pages on either side in my hands. There are certain devices that allow me to see it. Like, for example, there might be a scrubber bar at the bottom of the magazine I'm reading, or in an ebook there's a table of contents that I can refer to. But really there's no way immediately I can tell. So as a designer, you need to be very careful about how you allow your audience to access the content. A better way of saying is you have to be more careful that you do allow the audience to access the content in a way that's very easy, that's not going to frustrate them. You don't really want them to be clicking around 7 times to try to find it. I'm a big believer of the law of threes. You're going to want to get them where they want to go within 3 clicks or taps. They'll definitely tap once, they may tap twice. To tap a 3rd time, you're really starting to ask a lot, and it's got to be worth their while. Beyond that, people are just going to give up unless they really, really want to get there. Those are some very broad considerations of the different types of content. We're going to start to explore further by getting a little bit more specific about the technical aspects of tablet devices versus print, and then we're going to go even further and start to talk about some very specific design considerations.